Okay, I'm very excited to have on the Goldstein on Gelt show Yariv Haim, who is the founder and CEO at Sparrows Capital. Originally, I guess, from Israel. Now he's based in London. He specializes in what's called evidence-based and contrarian investing. Yariv, I want to start right off with explain to us what are these terms?
First of all, good morning, Doug. To keep it very simple, evidence-based investing is any type of strategy that is based upon empirical, robust evidence. I think this is somewhat new to the industry because normally people would have been asked to simply trust their managers. But today, more and more evidence surfaces indicating that the academic evidence suggests that actually that's not necessarily the only way to go forward with your investing.
You're suggesting that clients should look for evidence outside of what the managers do, or is this advice also for managers? They should be investing based on some sort of empirical, robust evidence.
I think it's both. Evidence-based investing can be implemented both on the investor side and the manager's side. But the evidence for managers is not necessarily as supportive as many of us were led to believe.
What do you mean by that?
What I mean by that is once you look at the evidence that the managers leave behind, their track record, you find that many of them, net of fees, do not outperform market performance. And this has been identified not only by the academia, but also by the regulators now in the UK and by very prominent active managers such as Warren Buffett, for example, who continuously argues that most investors should invest via index funds rather than via active managed funds.
Yariv, people talk about this a lot, and they often say that, if you just invest in the S&P 500, your odds of doing better than the average manager are certainly in place, and likely you will do better. One of the problems is today there are so many different indexes that people can invest in, and the S&P 500 as a capitalization-weighted index, the term we can touch on in a minute, certainly has its own risks. How can someone decide which index to go into, or is that really not your suggestion? Are you leading somewhere else when you talk about evidence-based investing?
No, I think you're absolutely right on both fronts. I think, one, it is a matter of expertise. So I do not advocate that people should stop hiring managers or investment advisors. What I simply suggest is that they don't only trust their manager to deliver the so elusive alpha, but also focus on strategies that will be implemented by their advisors to capture beta. And this is exactly what we do at Sparrows Capital.
Okay, so let's just define these terms for 1 second. You've said alpha and beta, or beta. Tell people what those are all about.
Yes, thank you. So beta is the performance of the market. If you buy the S&P 500, for example, as you've mentioned before, you will simply capture the US total market return by holding to a simple index. Alpha is basically the holy grail of investment management. Alpha is the additional performance that cannot be explained by a systematic exposure to the market. So in other words, this is the skill that the manager adds to the performance of your portfolio. So what happens is that we were constantly told for many, many years that we need to find managers who deliver alpha. And I think the discussion has moved on to where we recognize, because of the evidence, that alpha is very hard to extract, and therefore we put a portion of our portfolio, say your core portfolio, into passive strategies, trying to capture beta, market performance while bearing market risks. And you can accompany that with satellite strategies, which do still try to capture alpha in more exotic or niche markets.
We're talking with Yariv Haim, who is the founder and CEO at Sparrows Capital. Actually, you probably heard the name because previously we had one of Sparrow Capital consultants to the board, Professor Elroy Dimson, here on the Goldstein on Gelt show. If you missed that interview, which was really quite fascinating, you can find it at goldsteinongelt.com or simply go to YouTube and look up Goldstein on Gelt and Elroy Dimson, because all of the interviews, including the one we're having with Yariv today, get turned into videos and are available also on YouTube. Yariv, I introduced you before as someone who deals in both evidence-based investing as well as contrarian investing. Tell me a little bit about contrarian investing.
Contrarian investing, the name implies that it is to go against the market, against the trend. And the reason why contrarian investing exists in the first place is because when you look at behavioral biases, when you look at mistakes that investors tend to do, you find out more often than not that our behavioral biases are causing us to underperform rather than to outperform. So being contrarian, going against your instincts sometimes, is a way to protect our investment portfolio from our own behavioral biases.
Is it going against your own instincts or going against the market?
Sometimes it's both. Let me give you an example. If we go back to the global financial crisis in 2008 and 9, many of us saw how markets collapse, specifically the equity market. Now, when we see this happening and when we wake up in the morning and we read the papers and they're all about Armageddon Day and the end of the equity era, our instinct is to protect our investment portfolio. And our instinct is to sell out of a falling market. Now, fast forward 10 years forward, we know that many of the investors who did that basically did not enjoy the swift recovery of the market that happened later in 2009.
It didn't have to happen, though. Let's remember a little bit more in depth. At that time, when things were looking so bad and people were losing their jobs, they were losing their houses, they had lost half or more of their retirement plan, the talk was literally that banks that were holding people's savings wouldn't be able to give them back the money, and the FDIC, the Federal Depository Insurance Corporation, basically the U.S. government, didn't even have enough money to bail out those banks. So it was very, very scary. It was a dark time, and there were certainly many pundits who would say, well, it looks really awful. It could even get worse. How can someone decide at what point it's so bad that now we should become contrarian and say, oh, look, they said the world is about to explode, but now I'm going to buy?
I think that's a great question, and I think the answer is not a matter of timing. It's a matter of mindset. We know that fear and greed drive markets, and what you are describing is, in essence, fear. We see that banks potentially can collapse. We see our savings at risk. So fear creeps in, and it takes over our decision-making process. Being contrarian is not about trying to time when do we feel fearful or when do we become greedy. It is about constantly keeping a disciplined approach that overcome these emotional biases.
So in other words, you need to have a specific strategy for investing. Let's talk about one of the most common strategies, which is I'm a long-term investor and I'm just going to ride through the market, meaning I'm in my 30s or 40s and I don't expect to need this money for another 20, 30, 40 years. Let me just put it into the market and close my eyes and simply not worry about the day-to-day operations. Is that a legitimate strategy?
That is an excellent strategy. That is a strategy that I would argue most people need to adopt at an early stage of their life. Many of us save for our pensions, but we unfortunately do not adopt such a strategy, which is a very efficient strategy. Now, let me be clear. That strategy is not necessarily a buy and hold strategy. It does not necessarily mean you need to buy one index, one market, and hold it without doing anything else for 20 or 30 years. But there are strategies that are multi-asset, that rebalance in a timely fashion, and they use other accompanying strategies to support that long-term view you have on the market.
I think that's a great idea, and it's also a great place for us to end because we are just about out of time. Yariv, in the last few seconds, tell me, how can people follow you and follow your work?
Well, obviously, everyone can find us on the web. Our website is www.sparrowscapital.com, and they can also look for me on LinkedIn.
Okay, we will put links to all of that at the show notes of today's show at goldsteinongelt.com. Yariv Haim, thanks so much for taking the time.
It was a pleasure. Thank you, Doug.
You've been listening to the Goldstein on Gelt Show with money maven Doug Goldstein. Check out all of Doug's money ideas at goldsteinongelt.com. Doug specializes in helping people who live outside the United States handle their U.S. investment accounts. If you have a question that you would like answered on the air or off, contact Doug at his website or send him an email to doug@profile-financial.com.